Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Today, we are joined by Georgian political analyst Dr. Archil Sikharulidze to discuss Russian-Georgian and Russian-Armenian relations, as well as the wider struggle over the political future of the South Caucasus. Archil recently returned from Russia, where he took part in the Primakov Readings in Moscow and the Caucasus Dialogue in Pyatigorsk. These meetings brought together officials, researchers, and regional experts to discuss political change in Armenia and Georgia, greater power competition, and the future of regional security. Archil has also published several recent articles on his Substack page on Georgia's relations with Europe, the political divide inside Georgia, Ukraine's shifting approach towards Tbilisi, and Armenia's foreign policy shift and Georgia's growing role as a regional transport hub. We are going to include all of these links in our show notes. So please go to podcasts.groong.org/episode number. Check them out. We're also going to include Archil's excellent Substack link in those show notes. It's definitely worth subscribing to it and reading his articles. Dr. Sikharulidze, welcome back. It's always great to have you on the Groong podcast.
Archil, welcome back. Before the show, we were discussing, and I noticed you were drinking a glass of champagne to unwind, and then I'm drinking a glass of coffee. I don't know if you can see, so cheers. I need to gear up for the day. So anyway, yeah.
Cheers.
Here we are waking up. You are done waking up, and we hope to get there in 12 hours.
Archil, let us start with your recent visit to Russia. You attended the Primakov Readings and then also a dialogue forum in Pyatigorsk. Discussions, it seems, at both events addressed the situation in Armenia and Russia, as well as Russia's evolving position in the South Caucasus. This is in the midst of a massive de facto trade sanctions by Russia against Armenia. What were the main questions being asked at those forums? How do Russian officials and experts assess relations with both countries, Armenia and Georgia?
Well, once again, thanks for having me again. It's nice to be here. Yes, I would like to say that Primakov readings are one of the most popular, probably, for international experts to gather there in Moscow once in a year and discuss issues that we all have in our minds. And I was surprised to see how shrinked it was this year. And you could have felt extreme, if not dissatisfaction, but seriousness of everyone who attended the meeting. No more jokes, no more surprises, no more beliefs that the war can be stopped in 1 day or in 2 days or in 3 days. And obviously what I found out is that even those who may not agree with the central line of Moscow do consider this confrontation with European Union, and that they emphasize this, that this is now confrontation between EU and Russia primarily, and they put aside the United States of America. They say that we will never ever be able to work with EU like in the past. No more return back to the past. And one more issue that was staggering for me, that even my fellow colleagues said that we cannot lose this. Whether we like it or not, we should push till the end. And there is no way Moscow can agree on terms that are offered by Brussels. And I asked, what do you mean? I mean, what are the terms? And once again, these are people who may not agree with the lots of things that Kremlin is doing. But they said that we've been offered to be big Armenia or to win. And they meant here that if they follow what EU offers, Russia will be extremely weakened, divided, and actually destroyed as a superpower. On the other hand, they have only one way out, to fight and to push till the end. With regard to Pyatigorsk, We met there with my fellow colleagues like Alexander Skandarian, prominent Armenian political analyst, my colleague from Russia. And well, I think the main message was from Armenian side to Russians that do not listen to everything that Nikol Pashinyan is saying. Because to say something and to do something are two different things. They argued that even though there are some political statements, they are mainly for the internal society, for those who are listening in Armenia, but still Armenia is incapable of distancing itself from Russia seriously. So whether Nikol Pashinyan said this or not, Armenia will still be highly dependent on Moscow, and there are no alternatives. So the message was that this was pre-election campaign, and do not be misled by statements. On the other hand, I know Russian experts who were pretty blunt. They said, no more discussions with Yerevan, no more excuses, no more options. It's time to choose. You are either with us or you're against us. And this is what actually fits the general narrative that we all understand. There is no rooms for debates anymore, unfortunately. If previously Armenia and Georgia, we could have debate stuff with regard to Iran, to our interests. Nowadays, all sides are demanding to be fully in line what they ask us. So either Georgia follows what Brussels demands, or they're all we're against Brussels. The same with Yerevan. It fully fits the interests of Russia, or it opposes Russia. And one more thing, but this idea is not widely shared among leading Russian scholars. Some of them argue that Moscow should let Nikol Pashinyan to use his populist statements for the domestic usage and do not intervene, because sooner or later, they argue, people understand that the only real ally of Armenia in the region is Russia, not Azerbaijan, not Turkey, not France, or the European Union in general.
Yeah. Do you get a sense that Moscow sees the Armenian and Georgian cases as connected, or do they see it as two different problems?
Well, I think what I'm doing regularly, as well as my some colleagues, we draw parallels, obviously. I mean, it's impossible not to remember step that Georgian government made in early 2000s, 2008, 9, 10, and even rhetoric, the terms that are used by Nikol Pashinyan and his fellow colleagues extremely correlates what we're saying officials in Tbilisi. For example, at some point when Russia introduced sanctions, President of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, appointed Irakli Okruashvili as a head of attempts to diversify export of wine to EU and Ukraine. And even though they tried everything possible, still the lion's share goes to Russia. So we see the same in Armenia. We see that Moscow started using sanctions against Yerevan, even though they are not as aggressive as they used to be. And we know the statement by Foreign First Minister spokesperson Maria Zakharova, who said that we are not going to finance Armenia's European dream. So they obviously see this pattern. But in the same time, I think they understand at some point that still timing is totally different. 2003, 4, 5, and nowadays differ extremely. Geopolitics is different, and Georgia itself proved that if you do not push harshly, you can negotiate even with such kind of countries. I will remind you that Georgia went from being extremely anti-Russian to be moderate, like nowadays. And this is despite not abandoning the European way in general. Because at some point, even the most radical pro-Europeans and pro-Westerners realize that geography cannot be beaten. So you should either kill your state, you should destroy your economy or negotiate with Russia. And this policy of negotiating with Russia, trading with Russia, started not from Georgian Dream, but it started by Mikhail Saakashvili himself, because he came to a very clear realization. EU and US cannot provide you with economic stability and growth. And I think people in Moscow understand this. So on the one hand, they're pressuring Armenia softly, but on the other hand, they are giving Yerevan time to think. This is not something that happened with regard to Georgia.
We've talked with a number of analysts, and of course, Russia is fighting a big war, and it's understandable that as a result of that, some of the projection of power around its periphery is diminished. Do you believe that Russia is adjusting its regional policy now to take this into account after troubles with Armenia, for instance, and also like a neither here nor there relationship with Georgia? Or does it still have ambitions and expectations to have a dominant role in the Caucasus and essentially to dictate the situation in the Caucasus? And this is why there's a big surprise when apparently there is, Armenia is not towing the line. And what are Russians thinking about Russia's policy in the South Caucasus now? And what are the challenges to that kind of thinking?
Obviously, Russia's policy has evolved. Once again, if you look carefully to Georgian case, I remember because I was young by then, and I remember how harsh it was. If you do not follow sanction, expelling Georgian citizens from Russia, it was a very harsh decision. Prosecuting Georgians. On the other hand, now you see Armenia to 2018 revolution. Moscow's reaction was very soft. Do not interfere. Let Armenians to handle it. It was based on experience from Georgia, because in Georgia, Russia intervened. They supported the revolution, then they sacked the foreign minister of Russia, Igor Ivanov, for the mistakes. The same is happening in this case. Russia realized that some mistakes had been made in Georgia. I would say extreme mistakes. So now they're trying to balance. On the one hand, we should recognize there is still this firm hand policy in Moscow. It's Caucasia, it should come by tank, conquer it, and push people to follow. On the other hand, there are much more moderate and modern political analysts and decision makers who are saying that this time is done, this time is over. We do not send tanks anymore. Let's be wiser. Let's use American European techniques. Let's negotiate. Let's buy. Let's invest instead of pushing hard. And in case of Armenia, we do see this one. Obviously, it depends who you ask, because you said that you have interim political analysts. If you ask people who are what I call them extreme pro-Westerners in Georgia, they will say that Georgia has fallen to the Russian hand. Georgia is pro-Russian nowadays, but their arguments are very weak. Why Georgia is pro-Russian? Because we do not join to international efforts to impose defeat on Russia, but it will be self-destructive. It's nonsense. So if you ask our colleagues in Brussels, Georgia is pro-Russian because we do not work against Russia. On the other hand, they praise Armenia, even though Armenia is doing nothing against Russia, actually, except making political statements. So the demands from Brussels are extremely different to all three states in South Caucasus. Baku, no criticism, nothing, because they need oil and gas. Yerevan is still not attached to EU enough. So, okay, we'll let you to trade with Russia. Do not do anything against Russia, but make political statements. Strengthen your powers, clean up the political field for pro-European powers. Tbilisi, you can't do this. We have invested, we have supported you, you owe us loyalty. And there is a really nice report by International Crisis Group where they are clearly stating this stuff, that on the one hand, Georgia then asked Brussels to be much more soft, not to demand, to put itself in the front of the rivalry. On the other hand, Brussels, which considered that Tbilisi betrayed its geopolitical interests. And they are what put us to the what I call Cold War between Brussels and Tbilisi. We have full-scale Cold War pursued by Brussels against Tbilisi. In this wake, obviously, Russia is extremely occupied by Ukrainian case. Let's be honest with this. This is not special military operation. This is a fully waged war. Again, on the one hand, this is Russia. On the other hand, this is the West, United States of America, European Union, and Ukraine. And Russia has no more powers to impose its will on South Caucasus unilaterally. It needs actually some support. And this is what Turkey is doing. Turkey is using the Russia's weakness to strengthen its position in South Caucasus. But, and here are two questions that we should ask ourselves. Is Russia weak enough to leave South Caucasus? The answer is no. South Caucasus is extremely important for Russia. Maybe not as important as Ukraine and Belarus, but still the second most important geographically attached territory. It will never ever let anyone to be dominant here. And it has enough power to hold the ground. And one more question that lots of Georgians are asking themselves, does actually Tbilisi want to live in a region which is controlled by Turkey? The answer is obvious, no. Because if Turkey as a member of NATO state is being considered as a strategic ally, yes, but Turkey separately as a regional power obviously is not something that we would like to see.
If you look at realpolitik, Armenia's situation is pretty dire, right? But for ordinary Armenians who are caught in the crossfire between Pashinyan's Europe and Russia, and Pashinyan's policies that are destructive, I believe, to Armenia, it is still emotionally, in terms of morally, many Armenians feel betrayed by Russia, even though betrayal is not in the, I guess, in the dictionary in geopolitics. Many Armenians feel that Russia could have done more to prevent the collapse of Artsakh. In Russia, most of the time, many analysts, and I feel that this is a common sort of cliche, they say, "Kuda ani zenetsa?" Where will they go? You know, so it seems like the Russian approach has been nonchalance, meaning that we can do whatever we want, and they have no choice. So, do Russians now understand why, at least, it's very difficult now to win back the hearts of Armenians, some Armenians at least, who have this sense of being betrayed by Russia in the case of Artsakh?
It's a really good question. I think those people who used to say this statement that Georgia cannot escape, this is not something new. We have heard it 20 years ago. And the same with regard to Armenia. They're still on the same standpoint. Because as you perfectly said, there is no such thing as a betrayal in geopolitics. There is geography. You either recognize it or you do not recognize it. I remember my perfect meeting in Azerbaijan, Armenia, where representatives of Brussels were persuading us that geography doesn't mean anything. I was laughing a lot. But at least finally we know that it actually means something. Of course, these people do still think that there is no escape for Armenia. And they look at the geography and they know that at least half of Armenia will never ever accept Turkey as a key ally. So even those who feel being betrayed, let them feel so. But the rest understand that if you need to choose between Turkey and Russia, they do believe in this statement. They will always support Russian side. On the other hand, obviously, there are people who do not agree with this statement. I would say these are the same people who are calling for the Kremlin to be pretty soft and do not to interfere. Let Pashinyan to destroy himself. They say we could have, but what did Armenians, what did Armenians do for themselves? Why hadn't the Armenians done anything possible to avoid these consequences? And if we have engaged, would we help Armenians to win, or we would have inflicted even more suffering, turning Armenia to another battlefield? These are very complicated questions, and obviously, you should keep in mind one thing. Russians are not emotionally attached to this topic, contrary to Armenians. And this, you can feel this, when, for example, if you raise questions like Prigozhin's march to Moscow and Nagorno-Karabakh, Russians talk about Nagorno-Karabakh relaxed, cold-minded, but as soon as you raise the question of Prigozhin and march to Moscow, you feel the same irritations like in Armenia when it comes to Karabakh. No more sophistication, emotions. Russia cannot be defeated. The same with regard to Ukraine. So that is why what makes people very irritated, not responsive to questions. That is why you must be very sensitive when you come to these topics. And frequently I tell my colleagues from Russia that I understand that for you, like revolution attempts in Tbilisi are something that are very far away. You can be philosophical, the same with regard to Nagorno-Karabakh. But if you're smart enough, you should show some empathy. And this is what sometimes I think they really, really lack. They do not understand this. And then I remember I told them, now think about Nagorno-Karabakh when you speak with Armenians in the same context like Prigozhin's march to Moscow. And then you will understand why for me this is so painful. But once again, from my personal experience, Hovik, this is very complicated. Usually people speak on behalf of their own countries. They are emotional, but when it comes to other topics, they think that they don't need to invent the same feelings. So to sum up, yes, there are people who think that you will not run anywhere, and they bring the same Georgian example, saying that look at Georgians. They tried hard, they waged war against us, they did everything possible. By the end of the day, where do they send lion's share? To Russia. Who are the main tourists? Russians. It's not because we want it. This is the way it works, geopolitics. But on the other hand, of course, there are people who say that, yes, we made the mistakes, but still, France will not help you. Turkey will not help you. So you have just one option once again. Come to us and discuss. What I advise the Russians to finally, not to wait till the Armenians come. Finally come to Armenia and talk with people, because Russia must, if Russia considers itself to be a regional power, superpower, it must behave respectively. That is something that Russians do not sometimes understand. They want to be superpower, but they do not behave like it.
Right. Archil, there's absolutely no doubt, like you said, that there's deep distrust towards the Russians in Armenia, and that is the reality on the ground right now. From one perspective, the two countries are blaming each other essentially for the deep failures of their foreign policies. At the end of the day, whether you like it or not, hundreds of thousands of people have ended up destitute and ethnically cleansed from Artsakh. And certainly Pashinyan doesn't want to bear the legacy of that on his record. And the same thing with Russians. So whether they say, oh, this whole thread started with Pashinyan or this whole thread started with Russians, frankly, 150,000 people out of their homes. And somehow we need to find a solution to that one. But coming back to Hovik's question, I wanna understand a little bit more. Did you get the impressions that Russians understand that Georgia's cautious and non-confrontational foreign policy at present doesn't mean that Georgia has become pro-Russian?
Well, I think I must actually surprise myself and you too, because usually when we speak about what Russians understand or they do not understand, we are not very positive in Georgia, because those political analysts who are participating in decision making, do not be mistaken. There are a few really nice scholars who understand everything. And sometimes they've been asked by the Kremlin, but those who are actually making decisions, they do not try to dig deeper and understand. And this is what we get used to. We send them messages, we tell them, do not this, do not do that, please consider this. But the response is usually, this is Russia, we know what to do, we don't need your advices. And we also get used to much more sophisticated approach from Americans and Europeans, who always try to understand you. This time, we have vice versa situation. We have Russians who are extremely pragmatic. They say, we know that you are making money. We know that you realize that confrontation with Russia will lead only to disaster. So the reason why you've been behaving this way is not because you turn your back on EU or United States of America. It's because you realize that neither Washington nor Brussels will help you if something happens. So they really, really objective about the reasonings, about the arguments, contrary to our friends from American Brussels. For the first time in my experience, in my, I would say, 20 years of observing political process in Georgia, we do see that Europeans do not want to understand Georgia anymore. We meet people who say Georgia is pro-Russian, and they ask, can you tell me why? And the reason is, you have not introduced sanctions against Russia, you do not shout glory to Ukraine, you do not want to impose Russia's strategic defeat, you also listen to your Georgian Orthodox Church, and Georgian Orthodox Church is pro-Russian, and blah, 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 and you realize this is all some assumptions. But then you ask, if I introduce economic sanctions against Russia, what's going to happen? Nothing on the Russian side, but they will destroy my economy. Are you ready to help me? No, you are not. My Orthodox Georgian Church will celebrate 17 centuries of existence on my land. So why it is Russian or pro-Russian? Well, because they do not join the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but why should they? So lots of useless, I would say unethical calls to Georgia to do something that is absolutely against our national interests. And this is actually pretty dramatic because, as you said, Armenians, at least half of Armenians, feel betrayed by Russia. I would remind you that according to 2025 statistics, trust toward European institutions, the European Journal fell from 65% to 49%. For the first time in Georgian history, below 50%, because lots of people felt betrayed by EU. Not in the sense that they betrayed us, for example, geopolitically, but because of they are trying to push Georgia into confrontation against Russia, that Georgia do not want to have it. So we have this almost the same feeling. If you look at Georgian society, I think no one will oppose my statement that Georgian society is divided. On those people who said that EU is unfairly trying to impose sanctions on Georgia to punish Georgia. And those who think that this punishment is actually right, because Tbilisi dared to have different national interests. So if you compare Armenia and Georgia, some of Georgia have the same feeling with regard to EU, but what we never expected in this sense is that Russians will understand better Georgian politics than Europeans and Americans.
Given what you said about the evolving nature of Russian policies, they think that they are going to try and emulate some of what the West does. Did you see any evidence of how Russians are trying to deploy soft power in the South Caucasus? And if there are serious differences between their approach with that power to Georgia versus Armenia? In Armenia, I can tell you that having trade sanctions is not necessarily soft power. That's an attempt, maybe a failed attempt at hard power. It's going to cause a lot of hardship, but not necessarily turn anybody around. On the other hand, if they start promising huge amounts of investment, for example, they are offering some excellent deals, as far as I know, on the rebuilding the next nuclear power plant and things like that. Maybe that's a way to go forward. What did you experience at these meetings?
I will tell you a short story. Before the war, before all this that's happening now, the 2015, we had a meeting with Russian colleagues, and I asked almost the same question. I said, why don't you follow the same patterns that Americans are using? Invest to education, invest to youth, promote public diplomacy, try hard to avoid political issues. And the answer was very simple. Because driving tanks to your cities are much easier and cheaper than to use these techniques. And plus, conquering territories by hard force is something that we're actually excellent in. And soft power, we don't have staff members to actually follow these topics. Now we have 2026, and I think the reason why we do not see still soft power being applied is because it demands us but lots of knowledge and money. Money that is being sent to battlefield. So ask yourself a very simple question. Can Russia invest the same amount of money to Россотрудничество like Americans are doing, we used to do in USAID? We are speaking about the billions and billions of USD dollars. Hundreds of people nurturing public diplomacy for decades. And on the other hand, we have Russians who are extremely new in this field. So yes, they are trying, but not in a classical way. For example, contributing to rise of tourists in Georgia. This is one of the ways. Through tourism, try to build new bridges between Georgians and Russians. How successful? This is questionable. But still, this is some new way. Because if you check this data, before the war, situation between Georgia and Russia was much, much more there than after the war. Georgian cuisine is the second most popular in Russia after the war. Russian tourists are heading to Georgia on a regular basis. We have almost extremely well-built communication between our business. And this is in the wake of not having any diplomatic relations at all. I think this is not a bad expression of, if not soft power, but mindset that is being applied, that no more wars with Georgia. Let's negotiate. With regard to Armenia, yes, sanctions are not actually well received by Armenians. This is normal. Both Armenians and Georgians, when they are pushed hard, they will try to oppose. This is normal. But on the other hand, as you said perfectly, we have Rosatom that still offers Armenians a really nice and excellent deals.
Yeah.
So they are trying actually to invest in the field that they already know that they are the best. And obviously, nuclear plants are something that represent the strength of Russian Federation. Whether they have the rest of income to do something new, I have doubts, because we all know Russia's income comes from oil and gas. There have been sanctions, billions being invested to the war. So I think they're trying hard. But once again, you need to nurture new generation of people who look at Armenia and Georgia as not former Soviet states, but then fully independent sovereign nations with their traumas, with their ideas, and to apply new Russian policy. Policy is not built on, as Hovik said, one general message that we cannot run from Russia, and another one, if we try to run against Russia, they can always conquer us back. If you somehow reconsider this point, I think Russians can do much better than they are doing nowadays.
If we have time, I might ask some more questions about the internal politics in Georgia, because I think it's all related. But since we're on the topic of Georgian and European relations, your article recent that you wrote, why does Ukraine suddenly need Georgia? in that article, you argue that Kiev has softened its approach towards the Georgian dream after earlier attempts to isolate the government. Now, why does Ukraine want to restore political relations with Tbilisi? What other signs are there for this warming of relations? And has Kiev accepted that the Georgian dream is likely to remain in power in the coming years?
This is an excellent question. I think there are two standpoints, mine and opposite one. Opposite one, they're usually world supporter of Ukraine, say that well, big brother, we had previously one big brother, Russia, now we have another big brother, Ukraine, decided that Georgia is a poor and blank, that our country is being destroyed by Georgian Dream, so they decided to still communicate with Prime Minister of Georgia, Kobakhidze, and to somehow help Georgia come out of this political crisis. I think this narrative is extremely naive, even if I would say it's stupid. No power in the world is doing something because they want to help another one. There are some very deep interests. So what we should analyze context that we already have. Vladimir Zelensky sanctioned Prime Minister of Georgia. He sanctioned everyone in Georgia, almost the whole government. They never talked with this representatives, and at some point, they decided to unilaterally initiate dialogue in Yerevan, what was extremely strange. So we see the Vladimir Zelensky meeting with the prime minister, who he sanctioned, and who he called pro-Russian agent, and arguing that it's time for Kiev and Tbilisi to reconsider their positions. Then they had some dialogues between Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Kuleba, and Makabachurashvili. So what I do argue is this: it's obvious no regime change is taking place in Georgia for the next few years. Georgia remains number one when it comes to humanitarian help to Ukraine. Georgia remains one of the most friendly country in the world. Hundreds, thousands of Ukrainians still live in Georgia. They get help. They get all support they needed. And Georgia government never actually wanted to engage confrontation with Kiev. So I think that at some point, Zelensky decided that there is no simply common sense of being a rival with Tbilisi, especially when they realized that they were unable to persuade other countries that Ukrainian way is the only truth. They hope to persuade India, China, other countries, and they realized that there is no actually support, the same level of support like they have from EU. So they need allies. They need this country they can rely on. And their decision to engage was extremely pragmatic. We need someone, real ally in South Caucasus. And with all due respect to Armenia, that all this Armenian shift is mainly based on one person, on one cabinet. They can fall apart at any time. So this was a very pragmatic decision to simply restore something that shouldn't have been destroyed at all in general. But still, do not be misled. The narrative is still there. What we do expect is that there will be no more attempts by Ukrainians to contribute to sanctioning Georgian officials and to intervene to Georgia's domestic affairs. I would remind you, before that, Volodymyr Zelensky had an online speech in front of protesters calling to liberate Georgia from unnecessary regime. I do think that this reset policy will lead to much more soft politics in general, no more such open and direct interventions. And obviously, if you live in Georgia, you do feel that we are going to have another election in 2 years. Parties are preparing for new pro-election campaign, and I don't see any reason why should current government lose anything.
Yeah,
I am very firm in my assumption that you know that I told you before 2024 parliamentary election, the Georgian Dream gonna win. Now this I can say it's like July, the end of July 2026, that if nothing happens, and I don't see what can actually take place here, Georgian Dream will still win.
Now, if we zoom out a little bit and think about not just Ukraine, but Europe, Georgia's importance to Europe, I think, is not only political. Georgia is a key part of the Middle Corridor, is a key component of Black Sea transport links, and also even planned energy routes connecting Europe with Azerbaijan, Central Asia, and even China. Now, Armenia seems to be vying for that role, but I don't think it can be mutually exclusive. Does this mean in European minds that Europe still has to play ball with Georgia? And is the Ukraine example that we just talked about a sign of that, that Europe will also return to a more pragmatic approach towards Georgia? And lastly, what makes Georgia very difficult to bypass for Europe?
I think this is actually a really nice way to present what's happening on the ground. So let's once again look at history. 2022, EU demands, as we know, the demands, as well as the United States of America, from Georgia to be bold with regard to Russia. We've been asked directly, if not to open the second front, to engage in an attempt to impose strategic defeat to Russia. Georgian Dream said that this is not going to happen. Whether they thought about Georgian people or their own power, it's not the issue. Since then, Brussels was trying hard to initiate regime change in Georgia. I know because I talked with so many Europeans who said that this is the first time in history of their practice they've been told by EU officials directly not to have any debate with Georgian Dream members, not to engage in any dialogue. They've been not only told, but they've been warned. And when asked why, they said that this regime opposes our interests, this regime is pro-Russian, it must be destroyed, and we must bring people who follow our main line. This is not something that I'm trying to interpret. This is something that I've been directly told by my fellow colleagues. So does Ukraine's attempts to restore some kind of friendship with Georgia sign that Brussels is also thinking about that? I think it partially yes, because Ukraine, all steps by Ukrainian government are always in correlation with the main agenda that is coming from, I think, Washington and Brussels. On the other hand, I already mentioned the International Crisis Group report. This is the first report where they directly call on Brussels to stop engaging in confrontation with Tbilisi, where they argue that Tbilisi is still pro-European. It's time to be pragmatic. So we do see signs. But on the other hand, yesterday, there was European Union's 21st package of sanctions against Russia. And they sanctioned Georgian port of Kulevi, which allegedly used Russian oil and then sent it to the third countries. So this is the first official sanction against the Georgian enterprise. So the question is, if we do see some signs of pragmatic approach, why do Brussels still try to sanction Georgia? And these are not the first sanctions. UK introduced sanctions against Georgian TV channel Imedi, Post TV, and they are still trying to push harder in Georgia. So I would argue, and this is also written in the report that I mentioned, that there are two actually groups. On the one hand, we say Eastern European countries, Northern European countries, who are hardliners. I call them European neocons, who are saying that either Georgia will follow or it should fall apart. I think it's obvious. They need regime change. They need the government that will follow everything that they're telling them. And that's why they prize Moldova and Ukraine. On the other hand, we have countries like Luxembourg, like France, like Germany, who are still very moderate and say we cannot push Georgia if we really consider it ally to fight against Iran, fight against Russia, fight against everyone that we demand. This is a small country, so we need to introduce pragmatic approaches. That's why I think we see on the one hand some signs of introducing pragmatic approach. On the other hand, we have sanctions being sent to Georgia on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And one more issue. I think Georgia is becoming victim of its own internal political agenda. So many people who used to live on European American monies, who build their own careers on this, I would say, political ideology of Europeanness, they are actively persuading Brussels that the best way to deal with Georgia is to push Georgia till the end, to press it till the end. And this message is obvious. And I would like to bring just one example. The public defender of Georgia, Levan Yoseliani, just recently went to Brussels. He had been interviewed by oppositional channel. They asked, "What did you tell them?" And he said, "I told them that not everything they get from local opposition must be trusted. This is not objective reality." And he said one more very interesting thing. "I told them, and I told our Georgian political actors, there are some red lines that should not be crossed. Do not forget," he said, that the interest of your country should not be sacrificed for your own interests. National interest must be superior. And I think this was a message, clear message to Brussels, that you may not like Georgian Dream, but do not be deceived that Georgian Dream does not represent anyone. It actually represents lots of Georgian voters.
Yeah. Thinking only about the hard geopolitics, Archil, such as, for instance, and transportation routes, such as Middle Corridor and so forth, is Georgia, impossible to bypass for Europe? Because at one point we saw Europe like shifting statements saying that we now see Armenia as one of the primary routes for the Middle Corridor. Do you think that is just hyperbole, or do you think that European policy has now been set in stone, and for them, Georgia being anti-Russian is a higher priority than Georgia being part of a regional interconnected communications hub?
This normalization that is being pushed hard by Europeans and Americans between Turkey and Armenia, is this being done for, let's call it, geopolitical reasons, so that there is an alternative to Georgia leading between Central Asia, Azerbaijan, and Europe, so that they can bypass Georgia if necessary?
Yeah, an alternative, and essentially how difficult. I mean, is it a myth to say that we can bypass Georgia?
I think it's you have a really good point. I've been to Termes Dialogue last year. It is a platform where we have discussed the way Central Asian goods can move to South Caucasus and then to Europe. And to be fair with you, I haven't seen serious projects that involve Armenia. Some alternatives, yes, and I will tell you a very short story because it was a bit surprising for me. So there were presentations where you could have seen the goods going to, for example, Kazakhstan, from Kazakhstan through Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, and you can see the map, Central Asia. And then I saw that between Azerbaijan and Turkey, there was nothing, like white color stuff, like some buffer zone. And then Turkey and then going to EU. And I was like sitting there thinking, I do miss something here, because I see like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, below is Armenia, then some white stuff and going to Turkey. And then I was like, where is Georgia here? I mean, this white, black stuff was this actually Georgia? And actually it was really exemplary, because this is the way like Ursula von der Leyen talks about the middle corridor. If you remember, there's even Ilham Aliyev and Tayyip Recep Erdogan who told them a few times that you cannot bypass Georgia, and they even told her that you talk about Armenia, but you know that there is geographically Georgia in the middle, and the response was nothing, you know. But this presentation actually probably show us two stuff. The first one, alternative, yes, but main road, I think highly unlikely, because once again, I think there is very clear understanding in Brussels that Armenia is very shaky. You never know what happens there. Armenia is still not as reliable as Georgia can be, because still the influence of Russia is very strong, while Georgia, its political elites had been so cleaned from any Russian influence that they understand by the end of the day, Georgia is still the key ally, and Georgia consists from people who truly believe that the European way can be the only way. And I don't think that they feel the same with Armenia. So all this initiates that Asbeth mentioned, Trump Road, of course, this is alternative to Georgia, but they also understand that if something happens, the best road is the road had been double-checked previously. And the road through Georgia is probably the well-known one. And one more thing, do not forget that the new roads, they are very close to Iranian border too. So the question is, what happens if new war emerges between Iran and United States of America? And we have seen that then even hit Azerbaijan territory. So Iranians will not start the debate, they will not joke, they will hit hard in this case. So I think answer is yes. This is alternative. Yes, this is not the main road. Yes, the key reason why Brussels is trying to push the negotiation between Baku, Ankara, and Yerevan is purely geopolitical. It has nothing to do with peace, but at some point, it seems that they still hope, I mean, Brussels, to pressure Georgia till the end. If it will not lead to some positive outcomes, they know that they still can't negotiate with Georgian Dream, because Georgian Dream is sending every day a public letter to Brussels and Washington calling them to befriend them again. No, so they can always come back.
All right, Archil, let's turn to a slightly different topic. In your article, Patriarch of the Family, Not Patriarch of Europe, you argue that the Georgian Orthodox Church will continue to defend a traditional understanding of family, religion, and national identity in Georgia. So the conflict with Europe, has this taken on a cultural aspect as well as a geopolitical one? And can Georgia remain politically European, so to speak, while rejecting part of Europe's social liberal model?
Well, I think, let's start with your second question. I think it's up to Europe, actually. Once again, let's try to discuss what Georgians mean when they say we'd like to go to Europe. Economic prosperity, social prosperity, safety, and well-being. That's all. When we discussed a European future, we never talk about saying no to Georgian Orthodox Church, to rising against Russia, trying to defeat Iran. So the whole idea of Georgia's rejoining the European family was all about protecting our well-being in general. So when it comes to much more detailed discussions, we actually never had such discussions. No one ever asked Georgians, would you like to have church play the same role as it does in Germany, for example, where they're half empty, and let's be fair, there is no more God in the same sense as we do consider it in Armenia and Georgia. God for Europeans is democracy, constitution, and liberal or conservative parties. That's all. As my colleague used to say, God nowadays is just part of a culture, of tradition. And people go to church because they, as he used to say in German, ich muss, they must go to church to have a cultural dialogue. That's all. When we talk about God in our countries, we mean much, much more. you know, and it's all up to Brussels. If it demands, and it looks like it demands, to follow the main party line, like it was in Soviet Union, I don't think that Georgia can do this. I don't know anyone who will come up and say, for the European future, we can turn Georgian Orthodox Church to some kind of institution and let it go. This will never ever happen, especially nowadays when we see geopolitical shifts and crises. Crisis always leads people to unite around something. And what is the main key institution in Georgia that existed for centuries? Georgian Orthodox Church, Orthodox Christianity. And that is why I said that new Patriarch of Georgia made a very clear sign and message to everyone that he is not the Patriarch of Europe. He's not going to make some reforms, let women to be priests, help emancipation, prize LGBT rights. No, he's the Patriarch of family. He said three things, and you mentioned my article. He said one thing: all these left-wing theories are nonsense. Men are men, women are women, and family is at the core of our society that consists from men and women. Second thing he said, we do appreciate freedom, but we all belong to state and to God. So we have freedom, but women should reproduce, men should defend and fight. And this is traditional roles. And Georgia cannot afford to live otherwise because we have demographic catastrophe. Our population is getting smaller and smaller. And he made final message where he said the Georgians and Georgia in the way we know it exists because there are ethnic Georgians. So people who are devoted to their country, to their language, to their homeland, and to their religion. And this message was extremely controversial for those who do support European future, because they said that this is not something that they actually expected to hear from the head of the Georgian Orthodox Church. So yes, this message was obvious for everyone. And also, it was something actually people expected, because the previous Patriarch, Ilya II, he was old. Let's be fair. He hadn't had this energy. This young, he was elected to push forward. And I will remind you the new revelation that we just heard from official representative of Georgian Orthodox Church by Jaghmaidze, a very popular person, who said that at some point Europeans approached them and said that they would like to get help from Georgian Orthodox Church to promote one-gender families, one-sex families. And even, if I'm not mistaken, he mentioned Foreign Minister of Belgium, who told them that they need to help Georgian society to develop because they are behind modernity. And by preaching conservative values, they will never ever get to EU. So I think the final answer to your question is the Georgians will never ever let Georgian Orthodox Church disappear. And Europe is not ready to let Georgia to become part of EU on its main and key red lines. These red lines are pretty obvious. No diminishing role of church in its society.
Archil, you're implicitly answering some of the questions I had in my mind, because 2 years ago in 2024, there was a lot of NGO-driven anxiety in Georgian society with Ilya II and his conservative values. And there have been similar issues with Shio III, who succeeded him. But with Georgian Dream in control, that has been a lot more muted and a lot more smooth. So a couple of questions here. Is Georgian Dream defending Georgian society's values, or are they using religion and social issues to strengthen their hold on power? And the other one is, all that NGO-driven anxiety about social mores and values, is that part of Europe's written or unwritten a number of steps for Georgia to become an EU member? Like you have to make these changes, you have to bring down your church and its influence on society, et cetera, et cetera. Are they driven from Europe?
I think with regard to Georgian Dream, it's very complicated to say because, well, I don't know between Ivanishvili and Prime Minister Kobakhidze, are they traditional at some point? Yes, they are. Do they believe in charge? Partially, yes. But are they such conservatives? No, obviously not. So I would argue that they, on the one hand, they do share the idea that Georgian Orthodox Church played a crucial role in Georgian history, and it must be there, remain. But on the other hand, I would argue that they are playing, obviously, conservative part to consolidate society and to keep power in their own hands. So I would say 50-50. It's very complicated to argue, but obviously, Bidzina Ivanishvili's pre-election offer to establish Georgian Orthodox as a state and national level religion was purely populist statement. It was pushed hard just to send majority of conservatives in Georgia a signal that we are your party, not our opponents. With regard to NGO, yes, and yes, and yes again. So those people who argue that EU doesn't demand anything, they are either stupid or naive, or they are being paid to be stupid. Because how can you become EU member if you do not follow? And there are hundreds, if not thousands of directives. And this is written on the paper. This is not something we do argue. And one of these demands were liberation of policy, liberation of society, pushing ethnic minority, sexual minority rights forward. The same was, for example, women quotas in Georgian parliament. This was all demanded from Brussels. And this is a direct message from Brussels. You cannot be man of modern European Union and society unless you have widely accepted one-sex families, ethnic minority issues, also sexual minority issues put on the respective level. And if there is a church who opposes this, then the church must be put aside. And I would remind you that there were papers, hundreds of papers written by civil society organization members, where they tried to reconsider the role of Georgian Orthodox Church as one of the most prestigious institutions in Georgia in the wake of European integration. And the role that was allocated to church was very, very precise. Help Georgian society to be more liberal, more integrated to European values. But of course, they forgot to mention that liberation also means diminishing of Georgian Orthodox Church role in Georgian society. And people in church are not stupid. They perfectly understand this.
I just try to understand basically if the pattern of attacks on the Armenian Church in Armenia by Pashinyan's government, which basically followed its roots from the NGOs, which were driven from the West, is similar to what you are experiencing or have been experiencing in Georgia.
Well, actually, I think we should separate two issues. The first one is NGO agenda. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as a classical civil society in Georgia, in Armenia, in Russia, or in any post-Soviet space. This is a lie. Civil society has been established in European American societies as a part of cultural and societal development. So when we say about civil society, what we actually mean, for independent group of people, your own citizens, who decided to create some movement, finance this movement and fight for rights and promote some policies. This is the classical understanding of civil society. What we have on the ground are a group of people, our own citizens, that had been gathered by foreign agencies, finances by foreign agencies, to promote interests by foreign agencies. This is undisputable. This had never been actually questioned. So I call them hired Georgian civil society. So they are like corporation. They represent Georgia society at some point because they do have Georgian passports. They live in Georgia, but they do not create agenda. They do not have their own independent agenda, and they are paid for very particular steps. So this is one issue. Second issue, you mentioned Nikol Pashinyan. This also happened in Georgia. I would remind you that the third president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, was actually trying hard to put Georgian Orthodox Church aside. He was trying to diminish its authority because he was realizing that there cannot be two lions on one mountain. There can be only one power in charge. So if you have any other institution that is superior to your government, superior to your political power, that you are under a threat. So in this way, obviously, and Saakashvili tried hard to somehow fight back Georgian Church. He failed. Something is happening in Armenia. Nikol Pashinyan, that has his own view of real Armenia concept, realizes that there is some institutions that can fight back. And one of those institutions is actually Armenian Church. And that is what makes different our churches. It seems that Georgian Orthodox Church, thanks to Ilya II, has much more trust in society. Is much more, it seems, from my standpoint, reliable. I cannot imagine even half of what Pashinyan is saying doing with Armenian Church to take place in Georgia. The government would have been overthrown immediately. And I think Pashinyan feels this, feels the weaknesses in Armenian Church, and he's pushing this painful spot there. How far he can go, I think, depends on Armenian society. But once again, this has nothing to do with NGO. This is political rivalry, fight for authority, for the right to be dominant. With regard to NGOs, this is a fully different story. This is a story of a small group of people who are hired by foreign agencies. They may believe in these ideas. I do not exclude this, but they have a very particular agenda. It's not about power. It's about changing culture and society from inside. And to represent this as if it was the will of Armenian people, while it has been well prepared, financed, supported by foreign agencies. That is why Georgia introduced the so-called foreign agent law, where all these people should pop up and say, I'm promoting A, B, C, D because I'm paid A, B, C, D. And people know that this guy is not paid by me, citizens of Georgia. He's paid by citizens of the United States of America. And this does matter, actually.
Yeah. Archil, I want to take us shift a little bit and talk about relations between Armenia and Georgia. Armenia's relations with Georgia appear outwardly very collegial, maybe even warm, I would say. And the most eye-catching example was the prompt congratulations by Kobakhidze for Pashinyan's electoral quote-unquote victory when only 10% of the votes were counted on the night of June 7th. But Kobakhidze also in the past has made more dramatic statements saying that accusing local agents and their foreign patrons of trying to create tensions between Armenia and Georgia. And as part of those accusations, he also announced that European bureaucrats would not be successful in dividing Armenia and Georgia. In Armenia, I can say that this news got buried in the pre-electoral news cycle, but it was covered widely, I think, in Georgian press. Meanwhile, the EU is fully signing on to TRIP. We talked a little bit about that, making multi-billion-dollar deals with Azerbaijan, viewing Turkey and Azerbaijan as critical partners in the Middle Corridor. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, why? Why did Kobakhidze choose to become the first foreign leader to congratulate Pashinyan when only 10% of the ballots were counted? I don't think he's that ignorant. I don't think that he doesn't have any advisors that don't tell him, the ballots aren't fully counted, Mr. Kobakhidze. Don't do that yet. So why did he do it?
Well, first of all, he's not ignorant, but I think you exaggerate the level of expertise in Georgia. I think what lots of people do not understand, colleagues, we don't have Armenian studies in Georgia at all. I think sometimes people do not really understand in Armenia, because I had lots of colleagues, and I myself, I was like checking who won, what is disposition of power, and when colleagues said me saying that Kobakhidze is celebrating, I was like, okay, it seemed that he decided, well, he thought that Pashinyan will win. He is supported by EU, so nothing gonna happen with just call him and say, well done. But once again, do not exaggerate. Ask yourself how many times Kobakhidze before the war had been to Armenia. Maybe once, maybe none. How many times he had been to Central Asia? None, zero. How many times my colleagues who are now attending Yerevan on a regular basis had been to Yerevan before the dramatic changes? Zero. So it's not a secret. Russian studies, Azerbaijani studies, Armenian studies non-existent in Georgia as a serious field. And I see this on a regular basis. I just ask people what's happening, for example, in Armenia, they don't know. They only check situation when someone from Europe comes to Armenia to say that, do you see, Armenians becoming Europeans and we are behind. That's all what they know about Armenia. And the same with regard to Armenians. If you ask what you know about Georgia, they know only when it comes to trip, to Kobakhidze statements about Pashinyan and the soul. So do not exaggerate the level of knowledge. It's not ignorance. It's about not being interested at some point. Now, why he made these statements? Because people are not stupid. They all know that this money that used to come to Georgia now are going to Armenia, to Yerevan. And they know, and they just check it on Facebook, that those Georgian civil society representatives who used to take money, European, from Tbilisi to Yerevan previously, now is taking money from Yerevan to Tbilisi to avoid double check on borders. And I think this was a message to Yerevan that we know, we are not stupid. We know that now our civil society representatives are coming to Yerevan, getting agenda, getting money, coming back to Tbilisi. So don't do that. No, so it's not worthy. And obviously, I think Pashinyan also understands that if previously roles were totally different, Armenia was pro-Russian, Georgia was pro-European, and we still had good relations. But now that when the roles switched, Europeans made demand from Yerevan to be much more hardliners with regard to Tbilisi. And this was message to Kobakhidze that don't do this. It's not worth it. So we are still the closest allies of Armenia. Maybe we are not very active, but we have no interest against Armenia. We never had. So keep this in mind.
Yeah, but what are the exact tensions that Europeans are being accused of exploiting? I know, we talked about these competing corridors, or Georgia, Armenia being an alternative to Georgia. But do you believe that maybe even on a friendly level, there is some kind of a competition between Georgia and Armenia, just tactically trying to get more money? What are your thoughts about the overall health of the Georgian-Armenian relationship and attempts to divide it? Because I honestly believe that there was an Armenian analyst who, Hauko Badalian, I talked about it in our podcast a few episodes ago, who was saying basically that Europe, through Azerbaijan as well, will try to create crises between Armenia and Georgia and then solve it with Azerbaijan's mediation or somehow. So do you see any of that, or do you think this is just hyperbole?
Actually, what you are saying reminds me interview by I think he was Oxford professor Neil McFarlane, very popular Scottish scholar who used to study Georgia, and actually I think he also advised Georgian Dream at some point, and he mentioned the same. This is something new. He said after Armenia, Azerbaijan will take lead with Georgia, and Azerbaijan is help from Turkey will try to impose its own interests, Turkish Azerbaijan on Georgia too. This actually, I would say it was unexpected for lots of Georgians because they do not see the way it is possible. They still think that Turkey is NATO member, so it's like the West and it won't do this. But they underestimate international interests of Turkey in the region. So these are some arguments and statements on the ground. Whether they are actually applicable is questionable, because you raise a really nice question, but how can they do this? How can they initiate crisis between Yerevan and Tbilisi when, if you ask me, we have really nice, I would say, friendly relation, but that's all. I mean, once again, if you ask yourself, do we have really deep, excessive like cooperation between scholars? No. Between institutions, maybe once per year. So our friendship is actually based on this historic approach that Armenians and Georgia used to live near each other for thousands of years, and we should continue being in the same position. Let's do not change anything. Let's don't be too close or too far away from each other. So I'm not sure how can this be possible. The only way it can happen if Tbilisi, I'm sure that Tbilisi will never do against Armenia anything. So they're smart enough, they know that this state, if Tbilisi feels that political elites in Yerevan are trying to use the cooperation with Europe to somehow influence situation on the ground in Georgia, if they feel that Yerevan will be contributing to some intervention, this may actually lead to some crisis. And I will remind you, this had happened with Ukraine. Before this open intervention from Kiev, no one could have imagined that we'll have such a confrontation. But then we felt it. Representative of Ukrainian politicians came to Georgia. They made statements. They were extremely unpleasant statements. So unless Armenia will contribute to this, I don't think anything can happen. But I don't see the point. Why should the Armenians even try to do this? What are benefits?
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But looking at, I just want to close with a final look at the relationship between Russia, Georgia, and Armenia, a triad here. And we've talked a lot about the way that Georgia relates to Europe and the way that Armenia is relating to Europe and Russia. They're not 100% in lockstep. There are many differences. So I wanted to know if Armenia and Georgia can develop a common regional policy based on balanced relations with Russia and the West that is going to avoid the kind of confrontation that you just mentioned, so that they not necessarily lockstep, but at least when we talk about strategic relationship between the two countries, they can remain strategic rather than suddenly diverge and start working against each other. And the flip side of that, Archil, is, can Russia have a workable long-term strategy for both countries that makes sense for the two countries and doesn't necessarily pit them against each other?
Well, actually, the answer for your first question is yes. And we had a conference with my colleague who is working on logistics and all these corridors, the way goods can be taken from different regions. And his speech was all about this. He said that we, Georgian experts, as well as government, we do not see a threat in TRIP. We do not see threat in any alternative corridors. Actually, he said, contrary to this standpoint, we do communicate with our Armenian colleagues, telling them, let's do it together. Let's finally join our force and show foreign power that we have the common interests. If we open logistics, we can use our territory to take more good than we used to Europe. Increase of the goods coming from Central Asia to Europe will only help us to further make money. But this won't be rivalry. This will be cooperation for the first time in South Caucasus that is not driven from outside, but driven from inside. And I think it's really righteous. I think Georgian Dream is doing that. I think Georgian Dream, actually, well, we've been visited by Nikol Pashinyan, Georgian Dream members visiting Armenia-Azerbaijan regularly. I think this is the main message. I think Georgian Dream is saying that we want to live in a prosperous country. We want to live like Europeans, but we are pragmatic, and let's do it together. Let's do not let countries outside the region to separate us, as it happened previously for centuries. And I think the ball is on Armenian side this time. And even though if you criticize Pashinyan, I think Pashinyan is not stupid to not agree on these terms, because his position is very shaky. And he never knows when you will turn it's back on Pashinyan. I remember one disagreement between Tbilisi and Brussels led to a confrontation, and our relationship used to being built on a common ground for 2 decades. But everything collapsed just with a snap of a finger. Now, answering on Russia. Well,
I want to hear this.
We've already discussed Russia, but yeah.
No, but I mean, I highly respect Russians. I understand that they have their standpoint. I understand why these ideas come, from which what actually pushes Russia to behave in this way. But sometimes I do not understand why some ideas cannot be reconsidered. Sometimes Russians do not want to listen to Yerevan. And actually, sometimes we tell them directly what we do expect, like respect, consideration for our national interests, to put aside this harsh militaristic rhetoric, and finally to take into consideration our standpoint, our pain. And you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh. This is pain of Armenians. We say Abkhazia and South. This is our pain. But unfortunately, what we see, Russians are saying that, okay, your pain is your pain, but you should consider our pain mainly. and that is what makes us to separate our path, because I don't think Armenians and Georgians would like to mainly rely on pain that is suffered in Russia. We like our pain to be considered too. Do I think that there are people who share my views, your views? Yes, they are here. Do they make decisions? No, they don't make these decisions. Can they affect? Yes. Should we expect some more sophisticated policy? We are already, if you ask me, we are already witnessing the sophisticated policy. I don't think that there is anything else we can expect, because sophistication comes with years and experience, and I don't think that this experience is enough for Russians to change some mindset. So by saying this, I mean, I don't think that you should expect that Russian ambassador to Armenia will come and openly say that we fucked up, we made a mistake, we are sorry, but we are ready to discuss. This is not going to happen.
Well, I'm going to take the positive notes about cooperation between Armenia and Georgia as a note upon which we can close our show today. Dr. Archil Sikharulidze, thank you so much for joining us on Groong. We love talking with you.
Thank you for calling me. I hope the next time it will be much more positive in general.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
in 20 years.
we all say that, but knowing our region, in any case, thank you for enduring the hot Tbilisi weather to discuss our hot topics, and hopefully you can go and cool down now and have a good night, the rest of your night.
Thank you. See you later then.
Thank you.
That's our show. We recorded this episode on July 24, 2026. We've been talking with Dr. Sikharulidze, who is a founder of the Tbilisi-based research institute Sikha Foundation in the Republic of Georgia. He's focused on Russian and Islamic studies, and additionally, political processes and international relations in Ukraine, the South Caucasus, and Kazakhstan. For more information, you know the spiel. Podcasts.groong.org/episode number. Click on the bios and get a lot of information that we put in there.
And thank you everyone for your support in the past. Spasiba, madloba, shukran alutun. We will really enjoy your continuing support because we're doing a lot of projects which I'm confident that you will see and you will enjoy the result of. But the URL is podcasts.groong.org/donate. You can become a one-time contributor or more preferred, a monthly contributor, and send us a lahmacun or a coffee once a month, and that will keep us going. Thank you, everyone. I'm Hovik Manacharyan.
And I'm Asbet Bedrosyan. We'll talk to you soon.
Have a great day.